the insult. Patricia Reeves stepped out of her modest rental car and into the crisp, bustling evening air. The upscale restaurant loomed before her, its glowing sign and modern architecture radiating exclusivity. Dressed in a simple navy dress and carrying a well-worn handbag, Patricia adjusted her scarf and headed inside. She wasn't one for extravagance, but tonight she had made an exception. She was in town to attend a charity event for underprivileged children and had decided to treat herself to a nice dinner beforehand. The restaurant's interior was just as grand as its exterior, polished marble floors, chandeliers casting warm golden light, and neatly dressed waiters weaving gracefully between tables. The chatter of well-dressed diners filled the space, and Patricia felt a twinge of self-consciousness as she approached the hostess stand. Still, she reminded herself, I'm here to enjoy a meal, not to impress anyone. A cold welcome. Good evening, Patricia said with a warm smile as she reached the stand. A table for one, please. The hostess, a young woman with a sleek ponytail, gave her a cursory glance and hesitated. Do you have a reservation? She asked, her tone neutral but distant. No, I don't, Patricia admitted. I wasn't sure I'd be able to make it tonight. The hostess scanned the room, her lips pressing into a thin line. I suppose we can fit you in. Please wait here for a moment. Patricia nodded, clasping her hands politely. She could feel the eyes of other diners glancing her way, a subtle reminder of how out of place she looked amidst the sea of designer suits and glittering jewelry. After a few minutes, the hostess returned and led her to a small table near the kitchen door. It wasn't the most desirable spot, but Patricia didn't mind. She was here for the food and the experience, not the view. The rude waiter. As Patricia settled into her chair, Greg, a tall, sharply dressed waiter in his mid-30s, approached the table. His slicked-back hair and exaggerated smile gave him an air of smugness that was hard to ignore. Good evening, Greg said, his tone overly formal, bordering on sarcastic. Welcome to Le Mistral. May I start you off with something to drink? His eyes flicked briefly to Patricia's handbag, and his lips twitched in what she could only describe as disdain. Just water, please, Patricia replied with a polite smile. Greg nodded but didn't write anything down. Of course, he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. I'll be back, eventually. Patricia's smile faltered as Greg walked away, his stride almost mocking in its exaggeration. She brushed it off, convincing herself she might be overthinking his behavior. But when he returned with her water, things became clearer. So, Greg said, placing the glass on the table with a clink, are you familiar with our menu, or shall I simplify it for you? Patricia blinked, taken aback. I think I'll be fine, thank you. Wonderful, Greg said, feigning enthusiasm. Then take your time deciding. We wouldn't want to rush, unless, of course, there's a budget to consider. He smirked, standing with one hand on his hip as if daring her to respond. Patricia's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. Thank you, she said simply, her voice steady. She lowered her eyes to the menu, pretending to study it. Mockery and grace. As the evening went on, Greg's condescension became harder to ignore. When Patricia asked about a dish, he dismissed her question with a curt "It's quite elevated. You might prefer something simpler." When she ordered, he responded with a patronizing nod and a barely audible "interesting choice." The final straw came when Greg returned with her meal and muttered, "Enjoy, madam," in a tone so sarcastic it felt like a slap. Patricia met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Greg hesitated, perhaps sensing for the first time that his behavior was unacceptable. But Patricia didn't give him the satisfaction of further reaction. She turned her attention to her plate, determined to maintain her dignity. As Patricia ate, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. She had come here to enjoy a simple evening and had instead been made to feel small and unwelcome. The charity event she had attended earlier that day had reminded her of the importance of kindness and humility, qualities that seemed sorely lacking in her server. When she finished her meal, Patricia left a modest tip, took a deep breath, and exited the restaurant. She didn't need to cause a scene or demand an apology, she knew who she was and didn't need Greg's approval. Sharing with Keanu. Later that evening, Patricia returned to her hotel and called her son, Keanu Reeves. Their conversations were a cherished ritual, filled with warmth and laughter. As they spoke, Patricia shared her experience at the restaurant, not to complain, but to reflect on the encounter. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Mom," Keanu said, his voice tinged with quiet anger. "No one should be treated that way." "Oh, it's all right, sweetheart," Patricia replied gently. "People like that waiter, they don't bother me much. But it does make me sad to see how quick some people are to judge." Keanu paused for a moment. "Which restaurant was it?" Patricia hesitated, but Keanu's persistence won out. She told him the name. "Don't worry," Keanu said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll take care of it." Patricia laughed softly. "Now, don't go causing a fuss, Keanu." "I won't," Keanu assured her, though his mind was already turning. "But some lessons need to be taught." Patricia didn't know it yet, but the events of that night were about to set in motion a moment of reckoning that Greg, and the restaurant, would never forget. Keanu learns the truth. Keanu Reeves was no stranger to stories of unkindness in the world, but something about his mother's experience at the restaurant struck a nerve. Patricia Reeves was the embodiment of grace and humility, a woman who had instilled in him the values of kindness, respect, and generosity. The idea of anyone treating her with condescension or cruelty filled Keanu with a quiet, simmering anger. After their phone call, Keanu sat in his Los Angeles home, his thoughts racing. He wasn't one to wield his celebrity as a weapon, but this situation called for something more than idle frustration. He needed to see this place for himself. A plan in motion. The following evening, Keanu dressed in his usual low-key attire, a plain black t-shirt, a weathered leather jacket, and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his face. It was his standard look when he wanted to blend in, which, despite his fame, he managed to do surprisingly well. He called ahead and booked a table at the restaurant, making sure to use a pseudonym to avoid any special treatment. Arriving at the restaurant, Keanu pushed open the glass doors and took in the opulent surroundings. The marble floors and chandeliers were just as his mother had described, a sharp contrast to the warmth and simplicity she had brought with her. "Welcome to Le Mistral," the hostess said with a practiced smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Keanu replied quietly, giving the name he'd used. The hostess nodded and led him to a table near the middle of the dining room. He noticed she was polite but brisk, her attention darting toward other guests with more expensive-looking attire. Keanu sat down, scanning the room casually. He wasn't just here for dinner, he was here to observe Greg's behavior on display. It didn't take long for Keanu to identify Greg, the waiter his mother had described. Greg moved between tables with an air of arrogance, his smile wide but empty. His interactions were tinged with insincerity, his body language screaming disdain whenever he felt a guest was beneath the restaurant's supposed standards. Keanu waited patiently as Greg approached his table, offering the same exaggerated smile. "Good evening," Greg said, his tone overly formal. "Welcome to Le Mistral. May I suggest one of our signature cocktails to start?" "Just water, please," Keanu replied, keeping his voice neutral. Greg's smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Of course," he said, his tone dropping almost imperceptibly. "I'll be back shortly." As Greg walked away, Keanu noticed him glance at a nearby table where an elderly couple sat. The man wore a simple plaid shirt, and the woman's handbag looked well-worn. Greg's demeanor shifted instantly. His posture straightened, but his expression soured as he approached their table. "What can I get for you this evening?" Greg asked, his voice louder than necessary, drawing the attention of nearby diners. When the elderly woman asked a question about the menu, Greg's response was curt, "It's exactly what it says, a truffle risotto. Nothing complicated." Keanu frowned, watching the woman's shoulders sag under Greg's dismissive tone. The man at the table looked like he was about to speak up, but Greg cut him off. I'll give you a few more minutes, he said sharply, before walking away without waiting for a reply. A test of patience. Greg returned to Keanu's table with a glass of water, setting it down with a practiced flourish. Have you decided on an appetizer, sir? He asked. Keanu hesitated, glancing at the menu. What do you recommend? He asked, testing Greg's response. Greg's smile twitched. Well, our scallop crudo is very popular, he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe Keanu could afford it. Or perhaps you'd like something simpler, like the soup of the day? I'll take the scallop crudo, Keanu said evenly, watching for Greg's reaction. Greg nodded, his expression unreadable, and left to place the order. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his mind already turning over the events he'd witnessed. His mother's account hadn't been exaggerated, Greg's condescension and lack of professionalism were on full display. A closer look. Over the course of the evening, Keanu continued to observe Greg as he interacted with other guests. He saw the way Greg fawned over diners who arrived in designer clothing, offering them warm smiles and enthusiastic recommendations. In contrast, anyone who didn't exude wealth or prestige received cold, dismissive treatment. The elderly couple's meal arrived, but Keanu noticed that Greg failed to check on them after dropping off their plates. When the woman flagged him down to ask for an extra napkin, he sighed audibly before fetching one. Here you go, he said, barely making eye contact as he tossed it onto the table. By the time Keanu's own meal was finished, he had seen enough. The next step. Keanu paid his bill without fanfare, leaving an unremarkable tip to avoid drawing attention. As he exited the restaurant, he made a call to his assistant, explaining the situation in detail. We'll set up a meeting, Keanu said firmly. I'm not going to let this slide. He hung up, his mind racing with how best to address the issue. This wasn't just about Greg's behavior toward his mother or the elderly couple, it was about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their appearance or status, was treated with dignity and respect. As Keanu drove home that night, he felt a quiet resolve. Greg's lesson was coming, and it would be one he wouldn't soon forget. The revelation. A few days after his visit to Le Mistral, Keanu Reeves made arrangements to meet with the restaurant's manager, a polished and businesslike man named Victor Wallace. Keanu's team contacted the restaurant privately, ensuring the meeting would happen without fanfare or media attention. Keanu wasn't interested in making a spectacle, he wanted meaningful change. The meeting begins. Victor greeted Keanu with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Though he had been told a special guest wanted to discuss a sensitive matter, he hadn't expected the world-famous actor to walk into his office. Mr. Reeves, Victor said, standing quickly and extending his hand. It's an honor to meet you. What can I do for you today? Keanu shook his hand, his demeanor calm but serious. Thank you, Victor. I wanted to speak with you about an experience my mother had here recently. Victor's polite smile faltered slightly, replaced by confusion. Your mother? Yes, Keanu confirmed. Patricia Reeves. She came in a few nights ago, dressed simply, and was seated near the kitchen. She was treated disrespectfully by one of your staff. Victor frowned, his mind racing. I wasn't aware of any issues that evening. Could you tell me more? Keanu described Patricia's experience in detail, the dismissive tone, the patronizing remarks, and the condescension she endured. As he spoke, Victor's expression shifted from defensive to deeply concerned. I see, Victor said when Keanu finished. I'm truly sorry to hear that happened. That kind of behavior is unacceptable, and I'll address it immediately. I appreciate that, Keanu said. But there's more to it. I came in a few nights later, incognito, to observe the service myself. I witnessed the same waiter, Greg, treating other guests in a similarly disrespectful manner, specifically an elderly couple. It's not just about my mother. It's about how your restaurant treats anyone who doesn't fit a certain image. Victor's face flushed. Greg has been with us for a while, he admitted, but I've received complaints about his attitude before. I'll make sure this is handled appropriately. The confrontation. Victor excused himself briefly, returning minutes later with Greg in tow. Greg looked confident as he entered, his smirk faltering only slightly when he saw Keanu sitting across the desk. Clearly, he hadn't realized the significance of this meeting. "Greg," Victor began, his tone firm, "this is Mr. Reeves. He's here to discuss a very serious matter involving your behavior." Greg's confusion turned to apprehension as Keanu fixed him with a calm but intense gaze. "Do you remember serving a woman named Patricia Reeves a few nights ago?" Keanu asked. Greg blinked, then shrugged. "I serve a lot of people," he said dismissively. Keanu's tone sharpened. "You mocked her appearance, talked down to her, and treated her as though she didn't belong." "That woman is my mother." The color drained from Greg's face. "Your mother?" he stammered. I didn't know." "That's the point," Keanu interrupted, his voice steady but commanding. "You didn't know. And it shouldn't matter who she is. Whether it's my mother, a famous actor, or an elderly couple just trying to enjoy a meal, your job is to treat every guest with respect." Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Keanu raised a hand to stop him. "I watched you the other night," he continued. "I saw how differently you treated guests based on their appearance or perceived status. That behavior doesn't belong in this restaurant, or anywhere." A lesson in humility. Greg swallowed hard, his usual bravado gone. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't mean to offend anyone. I'm sorry." "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," Keanu said firmly. "You owe that apology to every guest you've disrespected. But an apology isn't enough. Respect isn't just a performance, it's a mindset. And if you can't embrace that, you have no business working in hospitality." Victor cleared his throat. "Greg, I think it's clear that we need to have a serious discussion about your future here. For now, you're suspended while we review this incident further." Greg nodded weakly, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation. He turned and left the office, his confidence shattered. Ensuring change. With Greg gone, Keanu turned back to Victor. "This isn't just about one waiter," he said. "It's about the culture here. If Greg felt comfortable behaving that way, it means the standards aren't being enforced." Victor nodded. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Reeves. I'll implement new training for the staff immediately, focusing on respect, inclusivity, and professionalism. And I'll make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated moving forward." Keanu's expression softened slightly. "Thank you, Victor. I hope you'll follow through. A restaurant like this has the potential to be a welcoming space for everyone, not just those who look the part." "I promise, we'll make it right," Victor said earnestly. A private reflection. As Keanu left the restaurant, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The confrontation hadn't been about vengeance, it had been about teaching a lesson that Greg, and hopefully the rest of the staff, would remember. For Keanu, respect and kindness were more than just ideals, they were the foundation of a better world. Later that evening, Keanu called Patricia to share the news. "Mom, I spoke to the restaurant," he said. "The waiter's been dealt with, and they're implementing changes to make sure this doesn't happen again." Patricia's voice was warm with gratitude. "Thank you, Keanu. I didn't expect you to go to such lengths." "Respect is something everyone deserves, Mom," Keanu said simply. "No one should ever make you, or anyone, feel less than they are." Patricia smiled on the other end of the line, her heart swelling with pride. "You've always been good at standing up for what's right. I hope they learned something from this." "They did," Keanu said quietly. "And so did I." The lesson. The aftermath of Keanu Reeves' intervention left a ripple effect throughout Le Mistral. The once pristine facade of the restaurant had been tainted by Greg's behavior, and Victor Wallace, the manager, knew it was time for serious change. Greg's suspension was the first step, but Victor was determined to turn this into an opportunity to transform the restaurant's culture. Greg's path to redemption. Greg's suspension wasn't just a disciplinary action, it came with conditions. Before being allowed to return, he was required to undergo intensive customer service training. The program, designed specifically for the hospitality industry, focused on empathy, professionalism, and the importance of treating every guest with respect. At first, Greg approached the training with reluctance. He viewed it as a punishment, a hoop to jump through to keep his job. But as the sessions progressed, something shifted. Role-playing exercises forced him to step into the shoes of the guests he had once dismissed, and testimonials from real customers about their negative experiences drove home the impact of his actions. During one session, Greg reflected on his behavior toward Patricia Reeves and others like her. "I judged people based on how they looked," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "I thought I could tell who deserved respect. I was wrong." By the end of the program, Greg wasn't just checking a box, he was genuinely re-evaluating his approach to his job and to people in general. A new era at Le Mistral. Under Victor's leadership, the restaurant implemented a series of sweeping changes to ensure no guest would ever feel unwelcome again. Staff attended mandatory workshops on inclusivity and cultural sensitivity, learning how unconscious biases could affect their interactions. New hiring policies emphasized emotional intelligence and customer-focused attitudes as key qualities for all employees. To reinforce the importance of these changes, Victor introduced a new mission statement: "At Le Mistral, every guest is a VIP, and every moment is an opportunity to create lasting memories." The restaurant also began holding quarterly staff meetings to discuss feedback and share success stories of exceptional service. Victor encouraged open communication among employees, fostering a team culture where everyone felt valued and supported. The transformation wasn't just internal, it extended to the guest experience. Patrons began noticing the difference almost immediately. Reviews praised the welcoming atmosphere and attentive service, and word of mouth brought a new wave of diners eager to experience the revamped Le Mistral. Patricia's return. A few weeks after Greg completed his training and returned to work, Keanu invited Patricia Reeves to join him for dinner at Le Mistral. Though Patricia was hesitant at first, she trusted her son's assurance that the restaurant had changed. When Patricia arrived, she was greeted warmly by Victor himself. "Mrs. Reeves," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to have you here. I want to personally apologize for your previous experience. It was unacceptable, and we've taken significant steps to ensure it never happens again." Patricia smiled graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Wallace. I appreciate that." As she was escorted to her table, Patricia noticed the subtle changes in the staff's demeanor. The waiters were attentive and respectful, their smiles genuine. The atmosphere felt lighter, more inviting. It was clear that the restaurant had taken its lesson to heart. A moment of reflection. To Patricia's surprise, Greg himself approached the table, carrying their appetizers. His expression was humble, and there was a sincerity in his voice that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Reeves, I'd like to personally apologize for how I treated you last time. I was disrespectful, and I regret my behavior. Thank you for giving me the chance to make it right." Patricia looked at him, her eyes warm but firm. "Thank you for your apology, Greg. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and I hope you've learned the value of treating everyone with kindness." "I have," Greg said earnestly. "I promise, things are different now." As the evening progressed, Patricia found herself enjoying the meal and the company. The staff's kindness felt genuine, and the food was as exquisite as the setting. Keanu watched his mother with quiet pride, knowing that her grace and resilience had been a catalyst for meaningful change. Symbolizing change. When the meal was over, Victor returned to the table with a small gift, a bouquet of flowers and a handwritten note thanking Patricia for her role in inspiring the restaurant's transformation. "You've helped us become better," Victor said. "And for that, we're grateful." Patricia accepted the gesture with her characteristic humility. "I'm glad I could help," she said. "It's never too late to do better." As she and Keanu left the restaurant, Patricia paused at the door and looked back. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, the warmth of the atmosphere a stark contrast to her first visit. she smiled, knowing she had been part of something bigger than a single meal. A lasting legacy. In the weeks that followed, Le Mistral continued to thrive under its new culture. Guests from all walks of life felt welcome, and the restaurant's reputation soared. For Greg, the experience was transformative. He became one of the restaurant's most attentive servers, often sharing his story with new hires as a reminder of the importance of respect. For Patricia and Keanu, the incident became a shared memory, a reminder of the power of kindness and the ability to turn a negative experience into a positive force for change. As they reflected on the journey, Patricia's words lingered in Keanu's mind. Kindness isn't just about what you do, it's about who you are. And when you lead with kindness, the world has a way of following. A heartfelt reflection. The evening after their dinner at Le Mistral, Keanu Reeves and his mother, Patricia, sat on the balcony of her hotel suite. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees. Keanu leaned back in his chair, sipping a cup of tea, while Patricia gazed out over the skyline with a serene expression. It was a wonderful meal, Patricia said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. I could feel the difference. It wasn't just the food or the service, it was the people. They seemed lighter, kinder. Keanu nodded, his face thoughtful. It's amazing how much can change when people are given the chance to see things differently. Patricia turned to him, her eyes filled with warmth. You gave them that chance, Keanu. You didn't just point out what was wrong, you helped them find a way to make it right. That's something to be proud of. Reflecting on the lesson. Keanu smiled faintly, but his mind was already turning over the events of the past few weeks. You know, Mom, this whole thing has been a reminder for me, too. It's easy to forget, in all the noise of life, how important it is to treat everyone with dignity, no matter who they are or what they look like. He paused, swirling his tea absently. Growing up, you always taught us that respect wasn't about status or appearances. It was about seeing the humanity in everyone. That stuck with me all these years, but seeing what happened to you at the restaurant, it hit me harder than I expected. Patricia reached over and rested her hand on his. I know it hurt you to see me treated that way, she said gently. But it's because you care so deeply about people. That's what makes you who you are. Keanu's lips quirked into a soft smile. You're the one who showed me how to care, Mom. You've always had this way of making people feel seen, no matter their background. Even when that waiter was being rude to you, you didn't lose your grace. That's what I admire most about you. Patricia chuckled. Well, I had to set a good example for you kids. But you've taken it further than I ever could have imagined. You've used what you've learned to make the world a little better, one small moment at a time. A new idea. Keanu leaned forward, setting his tea down. It makes me think, what if we could do more with this? Not just fixing one restaurant's culture, but spreading the message on a larger scale? Patricia tilted her head. What do you mean? I'm thinking about starting a new initiative, Keanu said, his voice growing more animated. Something that focuses on kindness, respect, and humility, values that should be universal, but that people sometimes forget in their daily lives. We could partner with businesses, schools, and communities to promote these values, creating spaces where everyone feels welcome. Patricia's face lit up. That's a wonderful idea, Keanu. And you're in the perfect position to make it happen. People look up to you, not just because of your fame, but because of who you are. Keanu smiled, his eyes glinting with determination. It could be something big. We could fund training programs, create resources, and even host events to celebrate acts of kindness. And it all started because of you. Patricia laughed softly. It started because of us, sweetheart. You took what could have been a frustrating moment and turned it into an opportunity. That's what makes the difference. A shared vision. The two sat in silence for a moment, letting the idea settle between them. The city lights shimmered in the distance, a quiet reminder of the countless lives being lived beyond their balcony. You know, Mom, Keanu said after a while, every time I think about what we've been through, losing Dad, the struggles, the lessons you taught us, I realize how much of my life is shaped by your influence. This isn't just my journey. It's ours. Patricia's eyes glistened with emotion. You've always been thoughtful, Keanu. And you've always used your heart to guide you. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. Keanu reached over and squeezed her hand. Thank you, Mom. For everything. Spreading kindness. A few months later, Keanu launched the Human Kindness Project, a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting empathy, respect, and inclusion. The initiative partnered with businesses like Le Mistral to provide training programs for employees, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with dignity. It also worked with schools to teach children the value of kindness, funding scholarships for students who demonstrated exceptional compassion in their communities. The project gained widespread attention, with supporters from all walks of life joining the cause. Keanu remained actively involved, often attending events and speaking about the importance of small acts of kindness in creating a better world. For Patricia, seeing her son's vision come to life was one of her greatest joys. She continued to inspire him with her quiet wisdom, reminding him that even the smallest gestures could ripple outward and create meaningful change. The story's legacy. One evening, after a successful gala for the Human Kindness Project, Keanu and Patricia sat together once more, reflecting on the journey that had brought them there. It's funny, Patricia said with a smile. That rude waiter had no idea he'd be the spark for something like this. Keanu chuckled. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the smallest moments. Patricia squeezed his hand. And you've turned those moments into something beautiful. That's what matters. As they sat under the stars, Keanu felt a deep sense of gratitude for his mother, for the lessons she had taught him, and for the chance to make a difference. The journey was far from over, but with Patricia by his side, he knew he was on the right path.